I am 72 years old, and for the past 3 years I have been living not in my own house, but in the house of my son and his wife, a place that was supposed to become a refuge for me in old age after I sold my little ranch-style home on the edge of town and transferred nearly every cent of the proceeds into their mortgage, because I believed at the time that family meant safety and belonging, and that if I invested my money into their lives, they would in turn invest their hearts into mine. The decision was made after the death of my wife Miriam, who passed away 5 winters ago after a short illness that left me unmoored, a widower surrounded by rooms that echoed with her absence. I thought that if I sold the house, gave up the quiet neighborhood where I knew every mailbox and sidewalk crack, and moved in with my son Daniel, I would regain some of the warmth that had vanished from my days. My late wife had always worried that I would end up alone, and I promised myself that if the chance came, I would never choose solitude over family. So I handed over the keys to the place where I had spent 4 decades of my life, signed the bank transfer that delivered more than half of their down payment, and carried my suitcases into their shiny new 2-story home in the suburbs, telling myself that I had made the right choice, that this was what a father was supposed to do. At first there was a certain comfort in waking to the sounds of life around me, the clattering of dishes in the kitchen, the voices of my grandchildren rushing through the hallway, the heavy footsteps of Daniel leaving for work before the sun rose. And though I no longer had the privacy of a house where every chair, every picture, and every drawer had belonged to Miriam and me, I told myself that privacy was less important than company. I kept busy with the small things that gave me a sense of usefulness. I walked the dog, a friendly golden retriever named Max, who seemed to understand more about loyalty and affection than many people I knew. I made breakfast when I was allowed, though often my daughter-in-law, Jessica, would wave me away from the stove with a tight smile and a comment that I might spill something or forget to turn off the burner. I fixed small things around the house, a squeaky hinge, a dripping faucet, though more and more Daniel would tell me not to bother, that he would call a professional. In the afternoons I sat in the backyard with Max, reading the paper and listening to the sounds of neighborhood life. There were moments, rare but precious, when the children would run outside and throw a ball with me, or ask about how their grandmother and I had met, and I felt then that perhaps the move had been worth it. Yet beneath these small comforts there was an undercurrent that I tried not to notice at first, because to notice it would have meant admitting that I had surrendered my independence to people who did not truly want me in their lives. Jessica's eyes often carried impatience when she looked at me, as though she had inherited a burden rather than gained a family member. Daniel, my only son, spoke to me in tones that were clipped and businesslike, as if he were managing a colleague at work rather than speaking to the father who had once walked him to school, sat with him through fevers, and worked double shifts to make sure his college tuition was paid. The grandchildren, 2 bright boys of 13 and 15, treated me with a mixture of indifference and amusement. They were not cruel, not at first, but they had already absorbed their mother's sharpness, the way she joked about how old-fashioned I was, how forgetful, how out of touch with the modern world. At family dinners, which I had once imagined would be lively gatherings filled with laughter and stories, I often sat silent at the end of the table while conversations flowed around me, with Jessica speaking about her job, Daniel about his projects, the boys about their sports, and nobody asking me much of anything. I tried to offer a story from my past, but often I was cut off by someone changing the subject, or a phone buzzing with a new message. In those moments I would lower my eyes to my plate, chew quietly, and remind myself that at least I was not eating alone, that the sound of voices around me was better than the hollow quiet of my old house. Still, the silence of exclusion hurts more than the silence of solitude. I began to notice how I was treated not as a man with a long history, not as someone who had once been strong and capable, but as a fragile piece of furniture that could be moved, tolerated, and occasionally dusted off for appearances. Jessica once told a visiting neighbor that I had given up on living by myself, as though independence were a childish whim I had finally abandoned, and I remember standing in the hallway, listening to her words, feeling them lodge in me like splinters. My presence in the house seemed to make her uneasy, perhaps because she had never truly wanted me there. And Daniel, caught between loyalty to his wife and to his father, almost always chose silence. I tried to excuse them, telling myself that young families are busy, that modern life is fast, that I could not expect to be the center of their attention. Yet in the evenings when I sat alone in my room with its unfamiliar walls and furniture that did not belong to me, I felt a hollow space open wider in my chest, the space Miriam had once filled with her laughter, her care, and her simple kindness. Max, the dog, became my truest companion. Every morning he waited at my door, tail thumping against the wall, ready for his walk. He followed me faithfully, looked at me with eyes that held no judgment, and sometimes when I sat in the backyard staring at the fading light, he rested his head on my knee, as though he understood what no one else cared to ask. I often thought how strange it was that the creature meant to guard the house had become the one who guarded my dignity. There were days when Jessica scolded the dog for being too attached to me, joking that he was more my pet than the family's, and I would smile politely while inside I thought that perhaps she was right, that Max and I had both been tolerated but not truly welcomed into this household. It is difficult to admit to oneself that one's own child has grown into a man who sees his father not as a source of wisdom or love, but as a responsibility to be managed. I had hoped for evenings of chess with Daniel, of sitting together watching old movies we both loved, of him asking me about the choices I had made in my career, the lessons I had learned about life. Instead, most evenings he arrived home exhausted, went straight to his office, or sat with his wife to watch shows I had no interest in, and when I asked if he wanted company, he often replied with a tired shrug or a vague promise for another time. That never came. I began to realize that my memories of him as a boy, clutching my hand at the zoo, asking me endless questions about how airplanes flew, were memories that belonged to me alone, not to the man who now lived across the hallway and rarely looked me in the eye. I told myself that maybe things would improve with time, that once they adjusted to having me in the house, they would warm to my presence. But as the months turned into years, I found that instead of growing closer, the distance widened. Small slights accumulated like pebbles in a shoe, never enough to force me to stop, but always enough to remind me of my discomfort. A joke about my shaky hands when I poured coffee, a sigh when I asked to watch a news program instead of a reality show, a pointed remark about how much space my things took up in the garage. Each one alone might have been forgettable, but together they created a portrait of a man out of place in what should have been his home. And yet I stayed, because where else was I to go, with no house of my own, no siblings left, few friends alive, and savings already tied into the roof above our heads? I told myself that patience was a virtue, that I would endure, that blood ties must mean something even if they seemed thin and frayed. But the truth, which I barely allowed myself to whisper in the privacy of my own mind, was that I was not a guest in my son's house, nor a cherished elder, nor even a respected equal. I was something between a tenant and a tolerated intruder, a man who had traded his independence for the illusion of family, and who now lived in a room that was not his, in a life that had no place for him. And as much as I loved Daniel, and as much as I wanted to believe that beneath his silence there was still the boy who once reached for my hand, I could not ignore the feeling that I had become invisible in his world. The only one who seemed to see me for what I still was, a man who breathed, thought, remembered, and longed for kindness, was Max, the dog, who never turned his eyes away, who never judged, who never forgot to greet me with joy. It happened as most turning points in life do, not in a moment of violence or catastrophe, but in the small and almost ridiculous accident of an old man spilling water at the dinner table. We were gathered one evening in early summer, the air heavy and warm, the windows cracked open to let in a faint breeze, and Jessica had cooked pasta, while the boys passed their phones back and forth, laughing at jokes I did not understand. I was seated at the far end, as usual, my chair slightly apart from the circle of conversation, and when I reached for my glass, my hand trembled in a way that was hardly noticeable to me, but enough that the glass slipped against the edge of the plate and toppled, water spreading quickly across the tablecloth. I immediately reached for a napkin, apologizing, though the apology felt unnecessary, for who has not spilled a drink at supper? Yet Jessica's voice cut through the room with a sharpness that made even the boys look up from their screens. "Honestly," she said, "if you're going to keep drinking like that, maybe we should just give you a dog bowl. It would save us the laundry." There was laughter then, not cruel perhaps, but careless, and Daniel did not correct her or defend me. He only smiled faintly, as if embarrassed, and went on cutting his food. I dabbed at the water with the napkin, feeling my face burn, and though I wanted to pretend it was only a joke, some harmless quip made in frustration, I could not shake the sting of it, nor the way the boys snickered afterward, whispering to each other, looking at me as though I were no longer their grandfather, but a character in a comedy skit. That night, when I went to my room, I told myself I would forget it. I told myself that families say things they don't mean, that Jessica's tongue was sharp, but her heart was not so cruel, that the glass had slipped and anyone might have said something in the moment. But the next morning I found waiting for me at breakfast, not my usual glass set beside the cereal, but a stainless steel bowl on the floor, placed neatly next to Max's dish, as if someone had decided to make a joke permanent. I stood there staring at it, half expecting someone to laugh and move it away, but Jessica breezed past me, poured herself coffee, and said without looking at me, "That way you won't spill." Daniel, who was buttering toast, glanced up briefly, then lowered his eyes, not a word escaping his lips. The boys were already at school, so there was no audience to witness my humiliation except the woman who had arranged it and the son, who would not defend me. I poured myself water into the bowl, not because I accepted it, but because in that moment I did not know what else to do, and as I knelt down beside Max, who wagged his tail and licked my hand, I felt a heat of shame spread through me, unlike anything I had felt since childhood when schoolyard bullies mocked the cheapness of my clothes. But this was worse, because those bullies were strangers, and these were the people I had given my life and my savings to, the people who were supposed to shelter me from indignity, not force it upon me. What begins as a joke can become a habit, and what begins as a habit can harden into a rule. Within a week it became a pattern that at meals I was given a smaller, sturdier cup, or sometimes none at all, and once when I asked for a glass, Jessica laughed and said, "What's wrong with the bowl? You and Max make such a pair." I tried to ignore it, to smile thinly as though I could brush it aside, but the boys began to catch on, their whispers turning into open giggles, one of them even taking a picture on his phone when I bent to drink. I told myself it was only the foolishness of youth, but when I later overheard them joking with a friend on a call, telling him that their grandpa drank like a dog, I realized that what had begun at the dinner table was spreading beyond the walls of the house, turning me into a story, a spectacle for others. The humiliation was no longer private, and I began to sense that something deeper was at work here, something beyond the sharp tongue of a daughter-in-law or the immaturity of children. It was as if a line had been crossed, and I was no longer regarded as a father or grandfather, but as an object of ridicule, tolerated in the house only because my money was tied up in its foundation. I remember one particular afternoon, unbearably hot, when I came inside from walking Max and found that the kitchen tap had been turned off at the valve beneath the sink, a trick I did not at first understand until Jessica remarked casually that "It's safer this way, less chance of a mess." She handed me the dog's bowl, filled to the brim, and said, "There you go. You're used to it by now." There was no smile on her lips, no pretense of humor. It was said in the flat, efficient tone one uses when instructing a child. I looked at Daniel then, my own son, sitting at the counter scrolling through his phone, and he did not look up, did not intervene, did not even acknowledge me. I felt in that instant the fragile remnants of dignity snapping inside me, and yet I forced myself to lift the bowl and drink, because what else could I do? What power did I have in this house where I owned the walls, but not the air within them? Max sat beside me, drinking from his own dish, and for a moment I thought we must have looked like a pair of beasts tethered together by leash and chain, except that he was free in his loyalty while I was shackled in mine. That night, lying awake in my bed, I asked myself whether this was truly happening, whether I was being slowly pushed toward the edge of the family in order that I might fall away on my own, sparing them the guilt of casting me out. It is one thing to suspect indifference, another to endure deliberate humiliation. I replayed the moment of the water spill in my mind, how small it had seemed, how trivial, and yet how it had opened the door to a cruelty that grew each day. I thought of Miriam, of what she would have said if she had seen her husband kneeling on the kitchen floor, drinking beside the family pet, and the thought alone made my eyes burn. She had always believed Daniel would take care of me, that her son would never let me suffer want or shame. I had promised her on her deathbed that I would stay close to him, that I would not withdraw into loneliness. Now I felt I had betrayed both her and myself, for I had placed my trust in blood ties that had grown thinner than water, and I was discovering too late that love could be replaced with calculation, respect with contempt. The catalyst, then, was not a single insult, but the slow, dawning realization that the home I had thought would protect me was, in fact, the place where my dignity would be stripped piece by piece, until I was no longer a father, no longer a man, but a dependent creature tolerated only so long as I bent my head in silence. It was the bowl on the floor, gleaming in the sunlight, filled with water, not for refreshment but for mockery, that showed me my true place in their eyes. And though I swallowed it in that moment, though I pretended it was easier to accept than to fight, something inside me hardened. For even the humblest creature will eventually resist being treated as less than he is, and though they thought they were reducing me to a dog, they did not understand that even a dog, when cornered and pushed too far, will bare his teeth. What began with a single bowl on the floor soon developed into a system of quiet humiliations that spread into nearly every aspect of my daily life, each one small enough that I could have convinced myself it was nothing. Yet, together, they formed a steady pressure that reminded me every hour of my diminished place in the house. At first it was just the bowl at breakfast, then the careful replacement of my glass with a cup so small it looked like it belonged to a child's tea set, then the quiet snickers of the boys as they passed me in the hall, whispering, "Don't spill it, Grandpa," as though clumsiness were my defining trait. I tried to laugh with them, tried to make light of it, but the laughter caught in my throat because I knew that what they found funny was not a momentary accident, but the image of me as someone weak, unstable, and ridiculous. I had not lived 7 decades, worked 2 jobs at a time, buried my wife with dignity, only to be reduced to a comic character in my own family's household. The true escalation began when restrictions crept into things that had always been natural rights of any man in his own home. One evening, after returning from my walk with Max, I opened the refrigerator to take a glass of orange juice, only to find a note taped to the shelf. "Please ask before taking. These are for lunches." The handwriting was Jessica's, neat and precise, and though the words were polite, the meaning was clear. I no longer had the same freedom as everyone else in the house. When I asked her about it later, she smiled in that controlled way of hers and said, "It's just easier if we keep track of what's for the kids. You wouldn't want them to go without, would you?" I swallowed my indignation, though inside I thought of the tens of thousands of dollars I had poured into the mortgage, money that could have given me comfort in my last years instead of making me feel like a trespasser in the kitchen of a house I had partly bought. Soon after, other restrictions followed. She began labeling containers, writing names on leftovers, reminding me gently that "this is Daniel's," or "the boys need this for tomorrow." The message was repeated often enough that I stopped opening the refrigerator unless it was to feed Max, and even then I wondered if she would soon claim that the dog's food was off limits too. The boys, emboldened by their mother's disdain, began to mimic her tone, and though at first their jokes seemed like adolescent mischief, they carried a sting that cut deeper than they knew. They filmed me once, bending down to drink from the bowl, and when I asked them to delete the video, they laughed and told me it was already sent to their friends. I felt then the kind of exposure I had never known before, the knowledge that my private humiliation was now a source of entertainment beyond the walls of the house. When I confronted Daniel about it, he sighed heavily and said, "Dad, they're just kids. Don't take everything so seriously." But how could I not? How could I not see that my authority, my dignity, my very identity as their grandfather had been traded for a punchline on a screen? Daniel's refusal to intervene cut more deeply than the boy's cruelty, because his silence told me that he, too, had grown accustomed to seeing me as an object of pity rather than a man. There were nights when I lay awake in my narrow bed, listening to the muffled laughter from the living room, and wondered if they spoke of me when I was not there, if Jessica mocked me in front of Daniel the way she did in my presence, if the boys imitated my stooped walk or my shaking hands when I was out of the room. It is a terrible thing to suspect that one's family finds amusement in one's decline, for it strips away the last comfort of old age, the belief that love is unconditional, that respect is earned once and carried until the grave. Instead, I began to see myself as they must have seen me, a man who had given away his independence too soon, who had traded his authority for the false security of a shared roof, who now lived at the mercy of people who considered him a burden. The shame of it gnawed at me, but so too did anger, a low, simmering anger that grew each time I bent to drink from the bowl, each time I saw Jessica glance at me with that thin smile, each time Daniel looked away instead of meeting my eyes. The worst moment came one evening when the family invited friends over for dinner. I had dressed carefully, wearing the shirt Miriam had once said brought out the blue in my eyes, and I hoped for a night of conversation, a chance to show that I was more than the silent old man who shuffled around the edges of their lives. The guests arrived, laughter filled the rooms, and I sat at the table, trying to join in, offering a story about my years working at the plant. But before I could finish, Jessica interrupted, laughing, and said, "Careful. Don't give him too much wine. He'll be on all fours with Max." The table erupted in laughter, and though some of the guests looked uncomfortable, no one defended me. I sat there frozen, my words cut off, my story unfinished, feeling like a child whose voice had been drowned by the teacher's scolding. That night I did not sleep. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, the laughter ringing in my ears, and I realized that the humiliations were no longer private, no longer confined to family. I had been reduced to a joke even in the eyes of strangers. I tried, in the days that followed, to hold my head high, to remind myself that dignity resides inside a man, not in the opinions of others. But even dignity needs air to breathe, and in that house the air grew thinner each day. Jessica began to comment more openly on my presence, sighing about the extra laundry, complaining about the smell of old books in my room, hinting that perhaps I should spend more time at the senior center instead of hanging around the house. Daniel said little, but his silence was agreement enough. I noticed how often he stayed late at work, how rarely he looked me in the eye, as though he too was embarrassed by my presence. And the boys, once affectionate if distracted, now treated me with open mockery, their respect eroded by the example their parents set. Once when I asked one of them to help me carry groceries, he laughed and said, "What's the matter, Grandpa? Did you spill your strength too?" The words were cruel, but worse was the casual way he said them, as though he had forgotten that I was the man who had once carried him on my shoulders through the county fair. The escalation was complete when I found myself planning my days not around what I wished to do, but around how to avoid humiliation. I timed my meals so I could eat alone in the kitchen after they had finished, sparing myself the sight of the bowl on the floor. I kept to my room during their gatherings, listening to the muffled voices through the walls. I walked Max longer than necessary, wandering the neighborhood streets just to feel a little free air and to delay returning to the place that was supposed to be my home. Yet no matter how I arranged my days, the truth pressed on me with a weight that grew heavier each week. I was not wanted, not respected, not even truly seen as a man. I was tolerated because my money was bound up in their mortgage, because my departure would raise questions among neighbors, because casting me out would tarnish their image. And so they did not cast me out with words. Instead, they pushed me toward the door with silence, with jokes, with bowls on the floor and restrictions in the refrigerator, with each small cut that together bled me of pride. It is said that old age teaches patience, and perhaps it does, but it also teaches the difference between endurance and surrender. I could endure the aches of my body, the loneliness of widowhood, the slow fading of strength, but I could not surrender my dignity, not to the people I had loved, not to the family I had trusted with everything I owned. And though I remained silent in those weeks, though I bent to drink from the bowl and laughed weakly at their jokes, something inside me was hardening, preparing, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. For humiliation, once it crosses a certain line, does not break a man. It awakens him. And I was beginning, slowly, painfully, to awaken. The breaking point came not in a grand confrontation, but in the suffocating heat of a July afternoon, when the sun blazed so fiercely that even Max panted in the shade, and the air inside the house felt heavy, as if every wall exhaled warmth. I'd been reading in my room when thirst drove me downstairs, expecting to pour a glass of water from the kitchen sink as I had done my entire life. But when I turned the handle, nothing came, not even the familiar rattle of pipes. For a moment I thought the system had failed, that perhaps the city supply was interrupted. Yet when I stepped back, I noticed the valve beneath the sink had been twisted shut, deliberately tightened so firmly that it required force to move. As I bent there on my knees, struggling with the stubborn metal, Jessica appeared in the doorway with her arms folded and an expression that contained no trace of surprise. "It's safer this way," she said evenly. "No risk of you leaving it running again." I opened my mouth to protest, to say I had never once forgotten to turn it off. But she did not wait for an answer. She slid a metal bowl across the floor, filled with cold water that glistened in the light. "This is easier, don't you think?" she added, her tone almost clinical, as if she were making an improvement in efficiency rather than imposing another humiliation. In that moment something inside me went still, a terrible clarity settling over me like a shadow. I saw that this was not a joke, not a passing irritation, but an intentional act meant to place me on the same level as the animal that wagged his tail beside me. Max drank from his bowl without shame because he was born to it, but I was a man. And the water on the floor was no longer just water. It was the line they wanted me to cross until I ceased to think of myself as anything but their dependent creature. I bent, not because I accepted it, but because thirst is relentless, and because pride, when tested against the body's need, sometimes must yield. Yet as the water touched my lips, I felt more than the sting of humiliation. I felt the sharp awakening of rage, not the loud, quick rage of youth, but the slow, cold rage of a man who has endured too much and finally sees the shape of the trap laid for him. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed listening to the whir of the ceiling fan and the faint laughter of Jessica and Daniel down the hall, and I understood, with piercing certainty, that I was not simply being teased or managed. I was being pushed, carefully and deliberately, toward a breaking point. If I left of my own accord, if I packed my few belongings and walked away, they would inherit the house without struggle, free of the 1/3 share I still owned, free of the presence that embarrassed them, free to claim every benefit of my years of sacrifice while I disappeared into the margins of old age. The realization struck me like cold water. They were not waiting for me to die. They were trying to make me erase myself, to surrender the last of my dignity and leave them the spoils. And for the first time in many years I felt a strange strength rise in me, the strength of a man who has nothing left to lose except the knowledge of who he really is. I remembered then the day we signed the papers for this house, how Daniel and Jessica had smiled, how the lawyer had explained that my name was on the deed as co-owner, that decisions could not be made without my consent. I had barely listened at the time, too distracted by the thought of being close to family, of fulfilling the promise I made to Miriam. But now every word returned to me with a new weight. My name was there. My share was real. They could mock me, silence me, diminish me, but they could not erase the ink on those papers. I realized, lying awake, that I was not as powerless as they wanted me to believe. They had tried to reduce me to the level of an animal, but in doing so they had underestimated the quiet resilience of an old man who still carried the instincts of survival. I would not leave meekly. I would not disappear into shame. If they wanted me gone, they would have to face the truth that the house they lived in, the comfort they enjoyed, existed only because I had poured the foundation with my own money. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, but silence is not the same as surrender. Silence is often the preparation for speech, and I was preparing, even if I did not yet know the form my answer would take. The crisis of that day, the valve shut, the bowl on the floor, the deliberate act of reducing me, was both the lowest point of my dignity and the turning point of my resolve. I drank the water, yes, but I also drank the knowledge that I had reached the limit of endurance. As the night deepened and the house grew quiet, I rose from bed, opened the drawer where I kept my papers, and touched the folder that held the deed, the bank documents, the records of the transfers I had made. I traced my name on the page with my finger, and it felt like a lifeline, a reminder that I still existed in more than memory, that my presence was written into the very structure of the house. They could not silence that with laughter. They could not erase that with mockery. And in that realization and that stillness of the midnight hour, I felt the first stirrings of something I had not felt in a long time. Power, faint and quiet, but mine. In the days that followed that stifling afternoon, when the kitchen valve was shut and the bowl became my only vessel, I began to look at the house with a new kind of vision, one sharpened by humiliation but steadied by determination, as though the ridicule had burned away the haze of habit and revealed the truth beneath every gesture, every silence, every glance exchanged between Daniel and Jessica. I noticed things I had once ignored, the way she spoke to him in low tones when she thought I was out of hearing range, the way he avoided my eyes when discussions of bills or mortgage payments came up, the way the boys repeated phrases that were too pointed to be their own invention, like old man liability or walking expense account. Each word struck me with a double sting, because it told me not only how they saw me, but also how deliberate their campaign had become. It was not simply the impatience of youth or the stress of modern life that made them cold toward me. It was a plan, subtle but steady, to dismantle my sense of worth until I either gave up my claim to the house or left it of my own accord, defeated by shame. And yet instead of breaking me, their cruelty began to illuminate their motives, and with each new indignity I felt my resolve strengthen, for the one thing more dangerous than an old man who has lost his pride is an old man who has reclaimed it. The escalation became unmistakable when I began to notice tampering not only with my meals and my access to the kitchen, but with my personal things, those few remnants of my former home that I had brought with me. At first it was subtle, a drawer left slightly open, my books rearranged on the shelf, but soon it grew bolder. The small tin box where I kept the letters Miriam had written me was moved from its place one day, as though someone had rifled through it. My medicines, carefully organized in a weekly case, were once swapped so that the morning pills were under the evening label, a mistake that could have been dangerous if I had not noticed. When I asked Daniel about it, his response was curiously flat. "Dad, maybe you're the one who mixed them up. You've been forgetful lately." The words landed with calculated weight, as though rehearsed, and I saw in his eyes not concern, but quiet satisfaction. I began to understand then that they were not only trying to shame me, but also to build a picture of me as incompetent, senile, incapable of managing my own affairs. Perhaps their ultimate goal was not simply to drive me out, but to have me declared legally unfit, so they could claim guardianship over me, and with it, the control of whatever assets remained in my name. My suspicions hardened into certainty when one evening, after another strained dinner where Jessica pointedly corrected me about the stories I told the boys, I overheard them speaking in the living room while I lingered at the top of the stairs, half in shadow. Their voices were low but urgent, the kind of conspiratorial tones people use when they know the truth of their words cannot bear the light. "He's slipping faster than we thought," Jessica said, her voice edged with impatience. "If we get the paperwork started soon, we can show he's not capable of independent living." Daniel murmured something I couldn't catch, and she snapped back, "You saw him today on his knees drinking from that bowl? Do you think anyone would believe he's fit to manage money or property?" He must have hesitated because her voice softened slightly, but carried a steel beneath it. "If we don't act, the house stays tied up and we can't make decisions. You want to keep begging him every time something needs fixing? Or do you want this place to finally be ours?" At that I nearly revealed myself, for the urge to storm down and confront them was overwhelming, but I forced myself to remain still, my hand gripping the rail so hard my knuckles whitened. Their words confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My humiliation was not random cruelty. It was strategy, a deliberate campaign to weaken my position until the law itself would side with them. After that night I resolved to become more careful, more deliberate in my own actions. I began keeping my documents not in my drawer, but in a hidden pocket of my old suitcase, which I locked with a small padlock. I carried a notebook where I recorded each incident, the valve shut, the mislabeled pills, the comments made at dinner, so that I would have a record should the time come to defend myself. I even went so far as to call an old acquaintance, Martin, a lawyer who had once handled some of my retirement paperwork, asking in vague terms about what it would mean if someone tried to declare me incompetent. His voice on the phone was cautious, but when I mentioned that my name was on a property deed as co-owner, he became more direct. If you are of sound mind and can demonstrate it with a doctor's evaluation, no one can take that away from you without a fight, he said. I thanked him and hung up quickly, my heart racing, for even speaking aloud of such things made the situation feel more perilous, as though I were stepping onto a battlefield I had not realized was beneath my feet. Meanwhile, the indignities continued, sharpening in ways that tested both my patience and my health. Meals became more controlled, with Jessica insisting that certain foods were not good for my stomach or forbidden by the doctor, though I had never been told any such thing by a physician. My portion sizes shrank until I found myself sneaking bread into my room just to feel satisfied, like a prisoner hoarding scraps. The boys, emboldened by their mother's authority, began to treat me less as a grandfather and more as a mascot for their mockery, imitating the tremor in my hands, repeating, "Don't forget, Grandpa," whenever I walked into a room, and once even leaving. A plastic dog bowl in my chair at the dining table. Jessica laughed when she saw it, telling them not to be mean, but her laughter carried approval rather than rebuke. Daniel said nothing, his silence now a language I understood all too well. Acquiescence, consent, betrayal. The true escalation, however, came one sweltering afternoon when the water in the entire neighborhood failed due to a main break, leaving the house dry for hours. The family panicked, filling buckets and pots with the little they had stored, but I had quietly prepared for such a day. In the garage I had kept 2 large containers of drinking water, a habit from years ago when Miriam and I lived through storms that cut power and water for days. When the boys cried out in thirst and Jessica fretted over how long the outage would last, I wheeled in those containers and set them in the kitchen. For a moment silence fell over them all, their eyes fixed on me as though seeing, for the first time, that the old man they mocked was the only one who had thought ahead. I poured water into glasses, real glasses, and handed them around, watching them drink greedily. The taste of that moment was sweeter than anything I had known in years, not because it erased the humiliation, but because it reversed it. They had tried to make me beg for water, and now it was they who drank, only because I had provided it. Jessica's lips tightened as she murmured a stiff thank you, but I could see the unease in her eyes, the realization that their campaign was not as complete as they imagined, that I still possessed a resourcefulness they had not accounted for. That night, alone in my room, I allowed myself a rare smile. The balance of power had shifted, not entirely, not permanently, but enough to remind me that I was not powerless. If they thought they could erase me with mockery and bowls on the floor, they had forgotten the stubbornness of a man who had weathered harsher trials than their petty cruelties. And yet I also knew the battle was only beginning, that the water I provided had bought me a reprieve, not a victory. For people driven by greed do not abandon their plans after one setback. They only adjust their methods, sharpen their strategies, and wait for the next chance to strike. And so I waited too, watchful, my anger tempered into patience, my pride coiled like a spring, knowing that the day would come when they would discover just how dangerous it is to corner a man who has nothing left to fear. I woke the next morning with a steadiness I had not felt in years, as if the long night of swallowing humiliation had finally condensed into a single, clear line inside me, and I followed that line through a series of quiet, deliberate errands that required no bravado, only patience and a refusal to be hurried or intimidated, beginning at my doctor's office where I requested a cognitive evaluation. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew they would one day wave my age like a flag and claim that I could no longer think or choose, and I sat through the questions and memory games and the gentle probing of a soft-voiced geriatrician who, at the end, signed a neat letter stating in clinical language that I was of sound mind and competent to manage my affairs, From there, I took the bus to Martin's office with my folder under my arm, and he read the letter, made a copy for his files, and helped me draft a formal notice of intent to partition the property if an agreement could not be reached, a document that did not shout but rather spoke in the calm, heavy tone of the law, which is the one language people like my daughter-in-law respect. Afterwards, I walked to the bank where a young manager with tired eyes opened a new account in my name only, transferred what remained of my savings, confirmed that no one else had access, and helped me set alerts that would chime my phone if anyone tried to move $1 without my say-so. And when it was done, I bought 2 more jugs of drinking water because the forecast promised a week of heat, and I had learned over a long life that strength is often nothing more than preparation hidden in a garage corner. By the time I returned to the house, the day had turned into the kind of July furnace that makes tempers short and mistakes common, and perhaps it was accident, perhaps carelessness, perhaps the simple punishment of physics, but a brittle hiss had begun under the sink and spread to a thin spray that wet the hardwood, and Daniel, sweating and frustrated, had shut the main valve to stop the leak while the plumber explained over the phone that he could not come until morning, and I stepped into a kitchen that smelled of hot wood and metal and the fine panic of people who suddenly realize how dependent they are on the things they never notice, because there were no bottles left in the pantry. The stores had been picked clean by the neighborhood the previous afternoon, and the boys were red-faced and dry-mouthed from basketball, while Jessica paced with her empty stainless bottle like a general, deprived of her radio. I said nothing at first, just lifted the latch to the garage, rolled in my 3 jugs, set them by the counter, and while their eyes followed the procession with the relief of parched travelers, I filled Max's bowl to the brim and let him drink first, not as a taunt, but as a correction to the order of things. Then I set 4 clean glasses on the counter and waited for someone to speak. Jessica recovered first because Pride is a fast runner, and she said that, of course, I should put those away and that Daniel would drive to get more from the next town or call a delivery or ask a neighbor, and the boys chimed in with nervous jokes that had the shape of requests but none of the humility, and Daniel, looking everywhere but at me, muttered that we could all use a drink while the plumber sorted things out. I told them I would share what I had and that I would do it properly into glasses because we were human beings, but that before a drop left those jugs, we were going to speak clearly for the first time in months. And I reached into the folder and laid on the counter, beside the sweating plastic of the water, 3 papers that did not tremble in my hands: the doctor's letter, the certified copy of the deed with my name printed as co-owner, and the notice Martin and I had drafted, which began with my full legal name and ended with a date by which I expected either written agreement for a buyout at fair value or my consent to sell the house on the open market. Jessica laughed in that bright, brittle way of hers that always sounded like glassware touching, and said I was being dramatic and ungrateful, that no judge would take such a document seriously from a man who drank from a dog bowl, and I told her, with a calm that surprised even me, that judges do not drink gossip. They read signatures and that the bowl had been her choice, but these signatures were mine. Daniel finally looked at me then, and there was a flicker of the boy I had raised, some mixture of shame and calculation, and he asked what I wanted, whether this was about an apology or about money, and I told him it was about the truth made plain, that the bowl would leave the house that day and would never return, that the muttered jokes and the filming and the small thefts of dignity would cease, and that within 30 days I expected either a notarized agreement to buy my share at a market, valuation we would both accept, or I would authorize Martin to file for partition and bring a realtor to place a sign on the front lawn, and that while we sorted it out, I would be moving out because no man should sleep under a roof where he is. Treated as less than his dog, Jessica's face tightened, her mouth a thin line, and she said I was threatening them in their own kitchen, and I said that threats are promises made in anger, while this was simply notice, and I turned the first jug and poured 1 glass, then another, then a third, and held the 4th back as the boys reached, because there are lessons that have to be learned at the temperature of need, and I told them they would take the glasses one by one, and they would address me by my name, not old man or grandpa, said through a smirk, but Dad and grandfather, and they would ask, not because I needed the apology to live, but because they needed it to understand that water and respect travel in the same vessels. The first boy, the younger, looked at his mother for permission the way children do when they are deciding whether to be kind, and something in his face softened, and he said, "Please, Grandpa, may I have water?" And I gave it to him and watched his throat work and felt no triumph, only a deep, steady sadness that it had taken heat and thirst to restore a simple word. Then the older boy asked too, stiffly, but without mockery, and I handed him his glass, and finally Daniel took his, saying, "Thank." "You, Dad?" And it was not a performance, but a rough, honest sound that reminded me of the voice he used as a teenager when he apologized for denting the car. And Jessica waited until the last, calling the ritual ridiculous, calling me manipulative. Saying this proved I was unstable, but even she could not talk away her thirst, and when she finally reached for the final glass, I kept it just out of reach and told her that the bowl was going in the trash and that she would say my name, and after a long breath pulled through her nose, she said, not looking at me, "Please, Robert." And I gave her the water, and she drank it in long, angry swallows that did not change the heat in her eyes. When it was over, when the glasses stood empty and the room had quieted the way rooms do after storms, I told them I had already arranged a mover for the following afternoon, to take the few things that were truly mine, that I would spend the night in. A motel and then elsewhere for as long as it took, that my mail had been forwarded and my finances secured, that the joint accounts were closed and the spare keys collected, and that a courier would deliver a second copy of the notice along with the doctor's letter to their email and their door by evening, not to embarrass them, but to make sure nothing went missing. And I watched Daniel nod slowly, his jaw set not in defiance but in the resignation of a man who sees the edge of a cliff he did. Not know he had been walking toward. Jessica said they would call a lawyer and that the world would see me for what I was. And I told her the world would see signatures and dates and a man who asked for nothing but what he owned and the respect he had earned, and I picked up Max's bowl, scrubbed it at the utility sink with dish soap and hot water after Daniel reopened the main for a moment, dried it with a towel, and placed it by the back door where it belonged, because some things must return to order before a man can leave them behind. I spent my last hour in that house quietly, packing the photographs Miriam had kept in a cedar box, rolling my few shirts, sliding the deed copies and letters into my suitcase, and when the sun lowered and the kitchen took on the amber light that always made Miriam hum old songs, I stood in the doorway and told them I would not slam doors or trade insults, that there would be no scenes in front of neighbors, that we would let the papers do the talking from now on, and that if they wished to buy my share, I would take a fair price and leave them to whatever peace they could build without me, but that if they chose to fight, I would meet them calmly, because I had already survived the worst of it, the night when a man is made to drink. From the floor, in the morning when he remembers he can stand up, then I carried my bag to the waiting cab I had ordered, patted Max one last time while he leaned into my leg with that steady, forgiving weight only a good dog knows how to give, and I left them in a house that still held my name in its walls, with 3 empty glasses on the counter and a notice on the table that said, in language without heat or cruelty, that the game was over, that the next moves would be made in daylight, and that the water would now be poured by my hand or not at all. I did not sleep much that first night in the motel, not because the bed was uncomfortable or because the air conditioner rattled, but because silence after years of suppression has its own weight, and my thoughts ran unbroken from one to the next, sorting through every word I had said and every silence I had kept. Yet when dawn came and the light crept through the thin curtains, I felt lighter than I had in years, as though the absence of their voices, their smirks, and the sight of that steel bowl on the kitchen floor had released me from a cage I had not known I was building around myself. I ate breakfast in the diner across the street, poured my own glass of water, lifted it steady without a tremor, and though no one noticed, though no applause followed, the simple act felt like a restoration, a reminder that dignity is not something another person gives you, it is something you refuse to surrender. In the days that followed, I found a small apartment on the edge of town. Nothing large, just 2 rooms above a quiet shop. But the windows opened to the street, and I could come and go without anyone telling me what was theirs or what was mine. And every evening when I poured water into a real glass, I thought of Miriam and how she would have smiled to see that her husband had chosen to stand rather than crawl. The legal process moved slowly, as it always does, with letters exchanged, valuations argued, and lawyers speaking in tones that turned human grief into numbers on a page. But I did not waver. When their lawyer tried to argue that I was no longer capable of independent decision, Martin produced the doctor's letter, firm and clear, and the matter ended there. When Jessica attempted to claim that I had intended the money as a gift, the deed with my name on it sat in the file like an unmovable stone. In the end, they chose the buyout, not because they wished to honor me, but because they wished to avoid the shame of a sale sign sprouting on their lawn. And so I received my share, enough to secure my years without dependence, enough to know that I had not been erased. I did not attend the signing in person. Martin handled the papers, and I stayed in my apartment, drinking coffee by the window, watching the town go about its mourning. Later that day, when he called to confirm it was finished, I felt no triumph, only a quiet release, the way a man feels when a fever finally breaks. I saw less of them after that, which was both a wound and a blessing. Daniel visited once, alone, his eyes tired, his words hesitant, and though he did not apologize in the way I once longed for, he sat across from me for an hour, speaking of work, of the boys, of how the house felt different without my presence. I told him that love is not measured in proximity, but in respect, and that, though I would always be his father, I would no longer live where I was not honored. He nodded, and there was moisture in his eyes when he left, though whether it was regret or frustration I cannot say. Jessica never came, and I did not expect her to, for some walls, once built, are never torn down. The boys sent me a single message on my birthday, a photo of them holding a cake, and while it was brief, I accepted it as a start, for children often carry the weight of their parents' choices until time teaches them otherwise. As for me, I learned to build a life again, smaller but freer. I joined the senior center 2 blocks away, not because I needed distraction, but because I discovered that there were others like me, men and women who had been pushed aside in their own families, who carried stories of inheritance battles, of children who spoke with sharp tongues, of evenings spent in rooms that no longer felt like home. We played cards, we told our stories, we reminded each other that survival is itself a form of victory. Max came to live with me after Daniel admitted that the dog spent his days waiting at my door. It was the only decision that felt entirely merciful in the whole ordeal, and when Max stretched out at the foot of my bed in the new apartment, I felt more at home than I ever had under their roof. Now when I walk him through the neighborhood, people greet me not as a burden but as a man with a loyal companion, and I hold my head higher because I know that the line they tried to push me across, the line where a man accepts that he is less than he is, was one I refused to surrender. In the quiet evenings, I sit by the window, pour myself a glass of water, and raise it not in bitterness, but in remembrance, for water is life, and life, however diminished, is still mine to live with dignity. And though they once made me kneel to drink beside a dog, it was I who made them beg, even if only for a moment, and in that moment the balance of power was restored, enough for me to walk forward into the remainder of my days, not as a victim, but as a man who remembered, at last, how to stand.